I'm Alex Gupta with UATV. Joining me from Washington, D.C. is Professor Samuel Wells. Professor Wells is a senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Hello, Professor Wells. Thank you for joining us at UATV.
Hello, Alex. How are you?
Oh, very well, very well. I wanted to ask you, a lot of people, we hear a lot of experts and overall society with this feeling that we are in a new Cold War. I want to ask you, are we in a new Cold War? And what are the similarities and differences from the Cold War that we know?
Well, there are many, and I would not, just to get to your bottom line, say we're in a new Cold War. It's a quite different kind of struggle with diverse opponents. Clearly, the Western allies have an increasing problem with Russia today. That's similar to the Cold War. We, of course, have a broader alliance now. All of the Eastern European former Warsaw Pact members are on the Western side now, and the conflict is fought out more in terms of hybrid war than in an arms race or missile counts. There is a other dimension to the conflict, which is, of course, the radical Islamist extremism, which, as I was commenting earlier, is a very different kind of warfare. It's not based on crossing borders or having columns of tanks. It is active in a certain number of spots, obviously Iraq and Syria foremost right now, but also there are evidences in the Philippines and elsewhere. And these distant elements from the Middle East are driven by discontent locally in various parts of the country, including the United States and Western Europe, and stimulated and informed by the internet and the capacity that ISIS and others have shown to make recruits and to motivate people to do serious acts of terrorism.
I want to ask you about NATO, about the transformation of NATO. I know you told me that you concentrate more on NATO in the 1950s, and starting with that, I want to ask you, we see Germany, Greece, Turkey, all three joined NATO in the 1950s. Why did they join NATO?
Well, Greece and Turkey essentially joined because the United States, starting with the Truman Doctrine in 1947, provided security for them against subversion and communist agitation within their borders, stimulated in very large part by actions of the Soviet Cominform. So that's Greece and Turkey. Germany, of course, we're talking about the Federal Republic of Germany, not the Democratic Republic of Germany. Germany joined because they were both divided and under threat from the Soviets. The most significant portion or form of the threat had been in the Berlin blockade, which the Soviets imposed in 1948. So the problem with Germany coming in was that our former allies in World War II, notably the Low Countries, France and Britain, were very much opposed to having Germany come in right away. The British came around more quickly. The French took considerable persuasion. The Low Countries basically came along with the British. So it was all a security argument, which was crystallized by the Korean War. The arming of Germany did not occur until after the war had broken out. And there was real pressure from the United States to let Germany in. Now, the Germans didn't come in easily. There were huge numbers of Germans in West Germany who felt like they didn't want to be part of any more international struggle. They were still in the midst of recovering from disastrous war in Europe. So when the opportunity to join NATO came up, the vote carried by a single vote in the Bundestag. But Germany joined. It became a central and vital ally. And as the Cold War progressed, frankly, Germany became America's foremost ally, replacing the British. So there's a long period of transition there, and it involves a lot of changes, which we may get into as you wish.
Well, okay, let me ask you, we see Montenegro just finalized. They're now a member of NATO. Bosnia, Georgia, Macedonia are all on the radar. Are the Baltic states joined in 2004? Are all these countries joining NATO for the same reason that Greece and Turkey joined back in the 50s?
I think the reasons are somewhat more complex. It's not just subversion and opposition and disinformation, active measures coming from Russia. Although some of that was certainly present, apparently, in Montenegro. But there is a desire to be part of the Western club and to participate in Western economic and technical assistance. So that I think that's a big part of the motivation now, being part of a Western club and trying to anchor the politics and the economy in Western institutions. I think that, frankly, is a bigger part right now than the security component. And we will see how it goes in Bosnia and, say, Macedonia, because there are certain political obstacles in each country.
How has NATO really transformed since the 50s? Obviously, it's become bigger, but are there any ways, as far as principles, as far as strategically, it has altered since then?
Many. When the Korean War broke out in June of 1950, NATO was not a defensive alliance. It was simply a political alliance for the reassurance of the Europeans who were facing political and economic pressure from Russia. So what Korea did was to transform NATO. That's the first real transformation of the alliance, which had been originally signed in 1948. But the range of changes was huge. The United States sent significant numbers of new military divisions to Europe with all their equipment. 4 new divisions went in, many more naval ships based out of European bases. The alliance was created as an integrated alliance with a staff. It had not really had a significant staff to do planning and operational training before. And the United States nominated General Dwight Eisenhower, who was probably the principal U.S. hero in World War II, to be the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. So all of these changes made it into an active defensive alliance in which each side had forces involved, pledged to come to the assistance of the others if they were threatened or attacked. So in a shorthand phrase or a headline phrase, you would say the Korean War and the pressures that it generated is responsible for militarizing the NATO alliance from a political to an active defensive alliance. And things go on from there.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you: Is U.S. President Donald Trump, is he correct when he states that some member states of NATO have not paid their fair share?
Well, American leaders, defense secretaries, secretaries of state, and presidents have been saying that for close to 30 years. It was not as publicly said during the initial Cold War because we didn't want to upset the political balances in the member countries in Europe. But that certainly was a feeling. And after the Soviet Union broke up and there were numerous countries in Eastern Europe joining Partnership for Peace and so forth, it became obvious to American politicians that we were carrying the burden of the defense expenditure. The Europeans cut way back on budgets, and that has continued right up until almost the present. Budgets being cut to small percentages. Now, at various NATO summits, the U.S. would complain and demand commitments for increased spending, and countries would make pledges to do 1.5% of their GDP or 2%, as was the figure in Lisbon, and then countries simply didn't meet it. I think there are only 5 countries, excuse me, in the alliance that currently put 2% into defense, and several of these now, or a couple, are the Baltic countries where they have had considerable destabilization, cyber attacks, and forms of hybrid warfare. And the Baltics, frankly, are quite anxious right now.
I mean, should more countries be spending more? I mean, do you think that the lack of funding on some of the member states could potentially threaten the legitimacy of NATO?
Well, it could threaten the degree of American willingness to continue carrying the bulk of the expenditures. I've always thought that having a percentage of GDP as your target is only one index and perhaps not the most important. We have a number of militaries within the alliance who have chosen to concentrate on niche missions. NATO has approved those, but what it means is you don't have a properly integrated force. Each country among the larger economies has chosen to have a navy, an armored force, an air force, and what they need to do is to concentrate. Now, the thing that nobody wanted to pay for, and one example, is cargo aircraft devoted to military missions. So whenever there is a conflict and NATO agrees to send troops, whether it's to Afghanistan or to NATO countries in these coalitions of the willing, operate in Libya, they don't have the cargo aircraft, the lift, to get their men and equipment into the theater. So some country in NATO or some combination need to be providing lift that is subject to allocation across the alliance, because increasingly in future we're going to have coalitions of the willing, so that not all NATO countries, not all members are going to participate in an operation, but they do need the lift.
And my final question, we're in Ukraine, and NATO is doing a lot here. It has done a lot. It supplies a lot of money and funding and its expertise. But why isn't NATO more willing to become more involved in the conflict in East Ukraine, to really do more to help Ukraine, even though they are doing a lot?
Well, I think there are a combination of reasons among the members, but for each of those political, military intelligence reasons, they don't find that the Ukrainian government has been efficient with its use of resources in the defense and intelligence category, or that the government has been completely committed to providing the fighting force that's needed. There are too many militias with separate agendas. The Ukrainian army itself was among the last to really get fully engaged, and it's not, frankly, hasn't shown itself to be a partner that meets the economic and political transparency and lack of corruption that is preferred among the NATO membership. So at this point, I understand that Ukraine opinion is quite divided on whether or not they would like to be members of NATO. I think NATO is quite divided on whether they should be members. So it's a cooperative relationship, but it's quite a distance from being an alliance. So I think that's basically the reason why the limits are where they are.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Wells. It's really fascinating and informative. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, and good luck to you and the network.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I'm Alex Gupta with UATV. I was speaking with Professor Samuel Wells. He is a senior fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. You're watching UATV.